Next.js is a full stack framework, so we get both a client side as well as a server side. So on the client, we have client components, and on the server side, we have server components these days, server actions, as well as route handlers. These are basically your traditional API route. And with any of these three options that you have on the server side, you can do the traditional server side tasks. You can access your database in any of these. You can receive webhooks with these route handlers, so you can process payments, update your content from your CMS. You can even use Next.js just as your traditional API server with these route handlers. You can also SSR your pages, etc. So it covers most of the things that you would want to do on the server side. And if you have a simple project, that's probably enough. But I found that in the real world, if you're building a serious project, pretty much always at some point, you need a separate server, a custom backend. And in fact, you may actually already have a custom server and you're thinking about moving to Next.js, but you don't want to leave your already existing server behind. You want to keep it that way. And so you may have an architecture like this, where you have your Next.js app, which is basically this entire part here is one Next.js app, and then also a custom server, maybe an Express API, maybe PHP, Ruby, Go, Python, pick your flavor. But even if you don't have a custom server yet, you may still want that. In fact, you may need it at some point, because some of the things you simply cannot do on the server side of a Next.js application. Because when you deploy it to Vercel, for example, what you get is essentially a bunch of serverless functions behind the scenes, right? So your pages will be pre-generated as much as possible, so you get a bunch of static assets like HTML files, but anything that requires dynamic compute will be mapped behind the scenes for you on Vercel to a serverless function. And that's different from your traditional server, which is what people call a long-running server. So this one will be running even if there are no requests, it's still running, and that's the downside of them. You're paying even if you're not using them. But serverless functions, you're only paying for what you use, and there are other benefits as well. But there are also downsides with these serverless functions. For example, any task may simply not be able to run on a serverless function. So for example, if you deploy to Vercel and you are on the hobby plan, the free plan, you can actually only run tasks take at most 10 seconds. So if it takes longer, you'll get a timeout error. Now, if you upgrade to the pro plan, by default, it's going to be 15 seconds, but you can actually maximize this all the way to 5 minutes, which is already substantially more than what it used to be, but there will still be some tasks that are going to be too long for that. For example, I was actually building a startup which was rendering videos. I was using the Remotion library that allows you to create videos with React. So what this will do is it will stitch together the video, but it may take some time. It may take, if it's a longer video, it may take 20-30 minutes. So I cannot run that on a Next.js backend. I need to do that on a separate backend. So I created a separate Node.js server for that. And there are other tasks as well, like web scraping, that may simply take too long. Also, if you have background tasks or like a job queue or cron jobs, this may not fit properly within a Next.js backend. This may be more appropriate to spin out into a separate server as well. Also, the way that serverless functions work is you essentially spin up a lot of them as more and more requests are coming in. And they all will make a connection to the database in case you're accessing the database. So you may actually also run into issues, database connections, too many of them. You need to manage a pool of connections. They also suffer from cold starts because you're only paying for what you use. So as you don't use them, they're not going to be up and running. That means that once you do start getting requests again, it may take some time before they're up and running, and it could be a little bit slower in the beginning. Now, it's not a huge problem. It affects a small percentage of the total amount of requests, but still something you may run into. You also don't have a persistent file system. So these serverless functions, they don't share the same file system. So that means if you're using SQLite, for example, which is essentially just a file, it's part of your file system, you cannot use that when you deploy to Vercel. Or if you're just using a JSON file to manage data, that's not going to work. And there are other things as well, like WebSockets, that may not really work out of the box in a Next.js backend. Now, some of these things can be worked around, but it's just not ideal to put this in a Next.js backend. You can technically also host Next.js yourself, so you can actually also run it on a long-running server. It does have more complexity, and you may lose some features. That could be an option that solves it for your particular use case, but most of you will just simply want to have a separate custom server because there are other benefits to that as well. For example, if you have a custom server, you can pick the best tool for the job. So if you have a project that has a lot of machine learning or AI or data processing, you may want to use Python because Python is more popular for data science type of work. Or maybe you want to use Go for performance. Or maybe your developers simply have expertise in a different technology, so why not use that expertise? You can pick any technology you want for this separate server. With Next.js, you have to use JavaScript or TypeScript. Also, what if I make a mistake in one of my backend features, harm the entire app in Next.js? With a custom server, if I make a mistake there, well, it's isolated to just that service. We can also deploy this independently of the rest of the application. With Next.js, if you make a change in a server action or in a server component or route handler, you have to redeploy the entire app. Imagine you actually have separate teams of people working on the app. You're all working in the same app, whereas with a custom server, you can actually have multiple custom servers and each team could be working on one of them. So you get all of these benefits, right? So I should also put here, this is simply a more ergonomic setup, I think, if you have different teams working on the same project. Now, if you have a background in microservices, you probably recognize all of this. I'm essentially rediscovering the benefits of having a microservices architecture. Now, you may just want to have one custom server next to your Next.js application. And you can still deploy this to Vercel, by the way. So you can also deploy Node.js or Express API to Vercel. Now, the biggest problem you're going to run into, I found, was authentication, actually. So there are solutions to add authentication to the Next.js application, but how does that work if you also want to have, let's say, a separate API server, and those API routes also need to be protected. So what we want is that if we make a request from our Next.js server side to our custom server, we need to be authenticated. So this server side will need to send some token, let's say, to our custom server. Custom server can then verify that the token is valid. And we may actually also want to send requests directly from the client side to the custom server as well, which then also should have a valid access token. And what we of course also want is simply within our Next.js app, our Next.js server side may actually also do things like access the database, and that of course should also be authenticated. So here of course also the client, when it sends requests to the backend, we also want to make sure that only authenticated users can do that. So I'll quickly show you how to do that. I'm going to use Kind. I'm a brand ambassador for Kind. They have a wonderful solution for authentication and it's free up to 10.5k monthly active users. So we have two things here. We have the entire Next.js application. We can use the Next.js app router SDK by Kind. And then we have, let's say, a separate Express API server. Now, Kind actually also has an SDK for that, but we only need the app router SDK to create a token and so on. And then we can reuse that token to make authenticated requests to our separate server. So we don't need both SDKs, we only need one. Now, I like using the Next.js app router SDK because it also helps us with some utilities on the client. Now, just to show you how you could set that up in a folder structure of, right, so here I have an API folder where I put my Express API server. So all of the Express API server stuff goes in here. Then I have a web folder for my entire Next.js app. Right, so my entire Next.js app, just as you would normally use it, is all in here. And then you can also have a shared folder. Right, so if we have a database here, of course, my Next.js server side needs to access the database, but my custom server may also need to update the database. Right, so here in the shared folder, you may have some database related things that you can use in both your custom server as well as in your Next.js application. So let me show you the Next.js application as it is right now. So here's my Next.js application. You can see it's just a pretty standard boilerplate here. If I open up the source and if I go to my home page here, I just have this sample app, welcome to stock prices. And here is what you would see. This is the homepage, welcome to stock prices, log in to view stock prices and news. So let's say we have a dashboard route that should actually be protected, where you can view the stock prices and the news. Right now, if I go to /dashboard, I can just go there. I'm not authenticated. We have 0 authentication right now. And that's this page here under dashboard. You can see here I have my dashboard page and this is the home page. This should be public, but this should be private. So this is all just Next.js, right? So if we go back to the diagram here, what we're doing here is we just have 2 pages. Those are actually server components in Next.js. So those 2 pages are just here. So what we want to do is just protect this first. So we can just use this one app router SDK. So in the dashboard, I can register my application here with Kind. I can call that stock prices. Now Next.js is actually considered here a back-end web application. And then here we have a quick start. I will just pick Next.js, of course. All right, now we already created an app, so it's existing code base. Where is your project running? So this is something you need to pay attention to if you have multiple apps running. If you would run your Express server, let's say on localhost 3000, then your Next.js app is probably running on some other server. I am actually running this on localhost 3000. I need to set these callback URLs, boom, boom. I need to install this package. I already did that. I need to add my environment variables. And so here in my Next.js application, I have .env.local. I'm going to paste that right here. All right, let's see. All right, now within Next.js, we also have have these route handlers, right? So your API routes essentially. This is all just within Next.js. It has nothing to do with our custom server. We do need to add that here as well. So I will copy this path, and then here I can create a new folder, and then in there we need route.js, and I will just copy this and paste that right here, right? This is just a bunch of setup all for our Next.js application. Okay, and that should basically be it. Now we can add sign up and sign in buttons. So here what we want to do, of course, is we want to protect this page. The user needs to be signed in. So let's actually try protecting this before we add sign in and log in buttons. So if I go to the dashboard page, this is a server component in kind. If we want to protect this, we can do it right in the server component, or we can create a middleware file. Right? Middleware also only runs within our Next.js application, has nothing to do with our separate custom server. So they also show you how to do this with middleware, so you can easily protect many different pages in one go. So in this is all within Next.js here, right? So here I would create a middleware.ts file, and then here I can determine which pages should be protected. So here we only want to protect the dashboard page. We could do it manually for each page as well with get kind server session. I have a complete tutorial on kind, so check that out. So here with middleware right now, I'm just protecting dashboard. So if I do this, I'm not logged in. So you can see actually automatically when I try to go there, we actually already have a redirect there. So if I go to the home page, this is still public. If I try to go to dashboard, we should be redirected to the login page hosted by kind. Now it will say something about not being able to authenticate because we haven't decided yet how the user should be able to authenticate. So if we go to our application here, we can decide how the user should be able to log in, maybe with their password, passwordless, with their phone. I'm going to use GitHub here and I will save that right here. All right, successfully saved. If I just try accessing dashboard now again, I'm not logged in, so automatically I will be redirected to the login page, and now I can log in with GitHub. I haven't created an account yet, so it will prompt me to create an account. And now after logging in with GitHub, I'm redirected here to dashboard. So now I'm logged in and you can see indeed I have my access token here. Now this is all within Next.js. Now, of course, we want to make these requests to our custom server, which is also going to be protected. And we need to send along this access token to there. So we have now protected our Next.js application. There are many other things we can do here, but you can see now when I want to access a particular page that should be protected, which is just a server component actually in Next.js. And when I try to go there without being logged in, I'm automatically redirected to kind. And after login, I can actually access that page. So now we have set up authentication for our Next.js application. But now what if we have a custom server? Let's take a look there. I'm going to close out of this. I'm going to close the web folder here. Let's say we have an Express API server, and in here we have, well, let's see, we have a setup for a very simple Express server. And so course is, of course, one of the things you want to take a look at. I'm just going to allow everything here. But here we have an API route, and here we have API protected. And let's say this holds some protected stock prices data. How do we make sure that only logged in users can access this API route, or at least get back a response with this only when they're logged in? So what we're going to do is we're going to make a request from our Next.js server backend to our API route here. And then we'll also try to do it directly from the client as well. Let's try doing this. Let's try making a request somewhere from our Next.js backend to our API server here. So let's see, let's go to our Next.js application as well. Our dashboard page is a server component, right? So this is server side, right? So if we look at the diagram one more time, that's a server component that's running within the Next.js server side. Now from here, we're going to make a request to that API route. So in the server component, if you watch my channel, you know that we can do async await directly in here without use effect. I can make a fetch call directly in the function body here, right? And we get a response from that. So my Next.js application is running on localhost 3000, but the API is running on 3001, and the route to there was API protected. So this hopefully gives us some response. And let's actually try logging that. So console log data, and let's see what we get. So here on the left side, I have my Next.js app running. On the right side, I have my Express API running. Remember, this is a server component. So if you log something, you need to open up your terminal. It's not going to be in the browser tools. That's client component. And actually, you can already see I get a message here. This is protected stock prices data. Now, how is that possible? Because I'm not passing along any token. So right now, this is not protected. This API route here is just sending this back to whoever makes this request. So if we want to protect this API route, we can very easily do that with kind as well. So kind actually also gives you a JSON web token verifier that you can use here as middleware. I can actually just import this from Kind's other package, which is called Kind Node Express. The only thing we need from here is actually just this utility they have to verify JSON Web Tokens. So here I can then create the middleware. We use the imported JSON Web Token verify. And here you need to give the domain that you used with Kind. So this is going to be something like this. It's Kind's domain, but it's going to be your own name as the subdomain here. Now, there is something called the audience claim as well that we want to verify. And we'll talk about it in a second. For now, I will just leave this empty. This middleware, when there is a request coming into this route, it will go through the middleware first and it will pull out the request headers. And specifically, it's going to look for a bearer token. Right, you can do that manually as well, right? So you would do something like request headers, authorization, and you can grab the bearer token from the incoming request like this yourself and then verify it yourself. However, here it's a bit easier. It will do all of that for you. You just plop it in there. So now when I try to access that API route like this from our own Next.js server, let's see what happens. I just need to invoke this. And again, let's go to our dashboard page so that it will run again. Now, if you keep making requests, it may seem that you can still access the API route even though we are not passing along the access token. So how is that possible? Well, actually, it is not possible. Next.js actually caches this server component. So if you invoke it again, it may actually use a cache from before. So that's why we get the same results here. So what I like to do is sometimes you kind of have to delete this next folder here. So if I delete this and if I just restart the server here, the Next.js server, now it's restarted. If I now invoke this server component again, if I refresh here, let's see what we get. So now you can see we indeed get something here with forbidden, and actually here in our Express server we also see something here. So here you can see JSON Web Token parse error, empty JSON Web Token. So we're not passing along any JSON Web Token. And so what this middleware will do, it will return a response saying 401 error forbidden. Right, so that's why now we're getting this error here. So now we have protection in place here on our custom server. You need a valid token now, right? So now when we make a request here and we don't have that, we get that error. So now, of course, we want to send that along, right? So, and actually my Copilot wants to get it from local storage, which is not possible because this is a server component. There is no local storage. But how do we get the access token here then? Well, on the server side, anywhere on the server with Kind, you can use get Kind server session. So this allows you to get the access token on the server side, right? And actually, I just need to add the @ in front of it. So here we get all sorts of things. Now what we want is to get the access token, but we don't want it in decoded format because we want to send this along. So here we want to get the raw access token. So then here we get the access token. Now that's a function, so we do need to call that to get the actual token, get access token raw. So then here we get the actual access token, which we can then pass along, right? So here we just plop this in there. Now if I save here, now we are passing along the access token to our server. And let's actually try logging the access token to double check that we actually get an access token here. I will comment out the actual fetch call for now. So here, of course, we need to await this. So this is actually a promise. And if we do that and now save, you can see we are indeed getting this raw access token, right? So here you can see it's not decoded. That's what we need to pass along the API server, right? So now I'm passing this along as the access token here. And now you can see it says something about this is protected stock prices data. So now if I go down here on the Express server as well, you can see we get a message here, token is valid. So now we have successfully made a request from our own Next.js backend to a custom server, which is still protected. All right, so now what do we want to make a request directly from a client component to this custom server? Well, it would be very similar. So let's actually turn this into a client component. We can do that by just adding use client, typically not recommended for the entire page, of course, but let's see if we can change this a little bit too. So this is not going to work. So get Kind server session, that's all for server sides, whether it's server component, server action, route handler, that doesn't work on the client side. So we can also not make this async. So what we can use on the client side is use Kind browser, which gives us similar things here on the client. So here we get access to all of this, right? So we have all of these properties here. Now what we want is again, get access token, not the decoded one, the raw one, because that's what we want to send along. Just to quickly log this to the console. Now we actually need to take a look in the browser. So if I refresh here, let's see, we see access token raw, and here you can see now we have our access token on the client. Now if we make a fetch call to our API server, let's say we're doing some old school fetching with use effect, well, you would end up with something like this. So here you would create a function get data. So here we would make a fetch call again to same route. We pass along the token as part of the authorization header, and we will log the actual response. So if I save here, and now if I scroll up a bit, yeah, you can see here, I get message, this is protected stock prices data. So we got a valid response here. And indeed here, we also see here from the Express server that the token was valid. So if we use the Next.js SDK, it will give us a token, and then we can just pass along the token to our custom server, which is protected with middleware that's also coming from Kind. Now there's one more thing that we can do to make it safer, which is to also work with the audience claim, because it's just checking if the token is valid, right? So when we log in with the Next.js SDK, it will give us some token, but can we just use that token everywhere? Well, no, we want the token to only work for this specific custom server. So you can use the audience claim for that. So in Kind, I can go to settings, and all the way here at the bottom, there's API. So you can register your APIs with Kind. And actually, I already did this. So typically in a JSON web token, you would then see the audience claim. Typically, it's a URL, but it's not going to be called or anything, but it's just typically a URL. Since my Express server is running on localhost 3001, that's what I would use. To make it work with the audience claim, we do need to add this environment variable here. So it needs to be the exact same as how you registered it in your Kind dashboard. So this token that's going to be created is going to be meant to be consumed by our API server, which is locally at least running on localhost 3001. And then I want to connect this API to this application, Next.js application I have here. So very easy to do. Just one click, boom. Now the separate custom server is sort of connected with my Next.js application. So the next time that a token is created, in that token, there will be an audience claim. So let's actually do that. Let's go back to our application here. I'm going to log myself out. Kind, of course, has login, logout buttons as well. I have a complete tutorial on Kind, like I said. So here on the dashboard page, we could have a logout, and I will import that, and we will say something like log out. Okay, so we need to click on that. So here, if I make this a little bit bigger, you can see log out. If I click on that, you can see my cookies are going to become cleared. On the homepage, we might as well quickly add some login and register buttons as well. Login link, and there's also a register link, very easy. So now here I can click on login to log myself in and get a token again. I'm going to log in with GitHub again. All right, so now I'm back in the dashboard page. Now I have a new token, and of course it's encoded here, but if we actually decode it here, decoded access token, so we can see the audience claim. So if I save this here you can see now I have an access token. All right, so now here, when we log this, here I get the decoded access token. You can see in the audience claim, there is now this URL for our API server. So this token is meant for this URL. That's how you can view it. So then here on the API server here, we also have this audience option here, and we can specify that we only want to allow tokens that explicitly have that localhost 3001 in the audience claim. So then here, when we make request, let's see if we can still get the data. So I'm going to refresh here, and you can see I'm still getting the data here. So now this is protected even better. There may be other checks that you want to do here, like check for the scopes, but that's a topic for another day. This was an example of how you can set up your architecture with a custom server next to your Next.js application, including authentication, which is typically the hard thing to do right in a setup like this. But you can see with Kind, that's very easy to solve. So I'm Wesley, I'm a brand ambassador for Kind. So they are sponsoring me, but even if they weren't, I would still use their solution for my own Next.js applications, because authentication is just very hard to do properly yourself, especially once you start deviating from the standard path. Hopefully you found it an interesting video. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Have a nice day.